Lights FM.
Hey, we're Cubby and Christine. And Cubby, very good friend of mine, is joining us today. We were doing a podcast together, but of course, everything's been preempted with what's happening in the world. But Michael Riedel has been with the New York Post for 25 years. He knows theater inside and out. He's his first book, Razzle Dazzle, Battle for Broadway, was a New York Times bestseller. And now his second book, Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway, going to be a New York Times bestseller as well, because he's here with us right now. Michael Riedel, it is so good to see you. Welcome.
Christine, good to see you, if only on a Zoom chat, but I remember the fun we used to have doing the iHeartRadio Broadway podcast with all the big stars that would come through our studio. And
I know.
It was such a hopeful and great time for Broadway, and then the curtain came down, sadly, so abruptly. And it's funny, this book, Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway, is about Broadway in the 1990s and covers all those great shows that really made Broadway part of the mainstream of American popular culture again. Rent, The Lion King, The Producers, Chicago, Angels in America. And I finished the book on September 11th. I thought, that was an amazing, horrific, terrible time, but also an amazing time, because I saw the World Trade Center fall from my windows in my apartment in the West Village. And I thought, man, what's going to happen to this city? What's going to happen to Times Square? What's going to happen to Broadway? But within 2 days, Rudy Giuliani, then the mayor, said, I want the lights of Broadway up. I want Broadway shows open on Thursday night because I want to show the world that the terrorists are not going to bring this city to its knees. And I really thought that was a remarkable recovery. And that's why I called it, Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway. I finished the manuscript in February. I went skiing. I came back and Broadway was shut down the second week of March. And it has not been open for 8 months. And I got to be honest with you guys, I don't think it's going to be open until 2022, until there's a vaccine, when the actors feel safe to go back, the musicians feel safe to go back, and the audience feels safe to go back. So I've never seen anything like this in the 25 years I've covered Broadway. You could not engineer something worse for Broadway than a pandemic that's spread by people singing, spread by people playing instruments in the pit, spread by people sitting at close quarters in a Broadway show, coming together. The thing about September 11th was we did want to be together. As horrible as it was, you felt in New York that people they had to be together. They had to come together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is a pandemic that says you may want to be together, but you can't. And that's the worst
it's
thing.
It's like torture. It really is.
Yeah.
Have they thought about doing limited capacity and having the actors and actresses in a bubble, and TV shows are doing it, like the Bachelorette is doing it? I mean, is there any way to make Broadway come back sooner than later?
It's difficult, Cubby, because if you bring actors together, how do you do a romantic scene? How do you have
if they've been tested, if they're under the same bubble?
That is the thing. If you can test everybody, and I think we will have rapid testing, and you can test the actors. They come into the theater, they're tested. You can see it right away. They can do the show. The musicians come in, they're tested, they're okay. But the question though is, when does the audience feel comfortable and safe going back to a Broadway theater? I actually think that you can engineer it with the rapid testing, that the actors and the musicians can come back. But you have to remember, Broadway does skew a little bit older. You got to have some money to go to Broadway. And when will people feel comfortable coming back to sit in there's a kind of small theaters, not well ventilated. They were built in 1910, most of them. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we have the best ventilation going on. And the other thing too is Broadway is so dependent on the tourism business.
Yeah.
When did the tourists around the world who were flooding into New York in the 1990s, as I show in my book, that just made Broadway so vital, so important? I mean, Broadway was contributing $2 to $3 billion a year to the economy of New York City because tourists felt safe coming back to New York again. And they wanted to see Rent. They wanted to see The Lion King. They wanted to see Chicago. When do those people feel safe coming back to what was once the epicenter of the pandemic?
Absolutely. And it's so expensive to launch a Broadway show. You can't do it until you can have capacity, really. You can't do it for 25% of the audience, So I think that's a big factor as well.
But, you know,
Um,
I think the one thing that could come out of this, and not a lot of good is going to come out of this pandemic, but I do think we will get through it and we will soldier on and Broadway will survive. I have to say, Christine and Cubby, I felt the ticket prices on Broadway were getting a little too obscene
Mhm,
when they were charging $1,000 to see Hamilton.
mhm.
And when Broadway comes back, you cannot reopen shows and say, hey, by the way, we're back. And you guys who've been out of work for the last year and a half, hey, we're still going to charge you $1,000. Broadway has to figure out its economics so that you can entice people back to the theater at reasonable prices so that regular people like us can go to see a Broadway show, because Broadway was getting a little too rich for my blood, a little too for the 1%. And if it wants to come back strong, it's got to figure out a way to make those ticket prices affordable to entice people to come back.
hey, I want to talk about some drama here. You have a lot of drama in your book, and one thing you mentioned was like flops. Like you mentioned Hamilton. Obviously, that was not a flop. That was huge. Give me a shocking flop. I know you have it in the book, but what was something in the '90s that was supposed to be huge and just never took off?
Well, it was really Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard. I mean, Andrew Lloyd Webber, the most successful composer in the history of theater, worldwide theater, with Cats and Phantom of the Opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Evita. He wrote a show, which is a very good show, called Sunset Boulevard, and he opened it in the early 90s. And yet it was just, I remember going to the opening night, and it has a beautiful score. It's about this crazy old actress who was a star of the silent era, but then when talkies came in, she lost her world and she lives in this eerie mansion up there on Sunset Boulevard. I remember thinking, though, the show is eerie and strange. It's got some beautiful music, but it feels heavy because they were then spending so much money on shows, you know. Everything had to have a barricade in Les Miserables, a falling chandelier in Phantom of the Opera, a helicopter that flew out over the audience in Miss Saigon. Everything had to be big and expensive. And I just remember thinking, I was there at the opening night of Sunset Boulevard, and I thought, this show, it just feels heavy. It just feels heavy. And indeed, the entire thing was so expensive that it ultimately imploded on itself. But what comes next? Because remember, the British invasion of the 80s really controlled Broadway with Les Mis and Phantom and Cats and Miss Saigon. What comes after Sunset Boulevard? A show that none of us had ever heard of before, written by a kid nobody in my business paid any attention to. And I remember I got a call one morning from a press agent, and he said, you know, Michael, I've got some terrible news to tell you. And I said, what? He said, Jonathan Larson, who wrote Rent, died last night. I said, well, I don't know what to say, Richard. I've never heard of him or the show. It was a little off-Broadway show. So I said, you know, I can give you a paragraph in the paper, and that's about it. And the next night I went to see Rent, which cost $100,000 as opposed to Sunset Boulevard's $14 million. And suddenly Broadway was young. It was dealing with the issues of the day, AIDS, drug problems, gentrification. It had this amazing cast of kids you'd never heard of before. Idina Menzel, Taye Diggs, Adam Pascal. It was a rock score. It was a hip hop score. And you thought, my God, the whole musical landscape on Broadway is now going to change.
It reminds me of, it actually reminds me of music in a way, because music like has a pivotal moment. Like it was hair band in the late 80s, and then Nirvana and Pearl Jam came around, and the music pendulum like switched.
But it's amazing it's amazing, Cubby, how fast that happens. You know, you're kind of riding along with this wave of stuff, and then all of a sudden the wave ends, the wave crashes on the shore and does not come back. And then there's this other thing coming that you can't even imagine. I mean, that's the joy of what we do.
Right.
When the new thing comes in, that's the excitement of it all.
So Michael, I feel like you've met everybody, you know, again, I'll go back to when we got to do our podcast together and you'd be going to have lunch with some famous Broadway star or producer or director. Are we going to get any dirt in this book at all? Any behind the scenes Michael Riedel stories?
Oh, yes. Well, I will give you this fabulous quote about Sunset Boulevard, because remember, Patti LuPone was the star of it in London. And then Andrew Lloyd Webber fired her before she came to New York, and she sued him. And then he fired Faye Dunaway, and she sued him. And he had a falling out with Glenn Close, his big star on Broadway. But just to give you a little sample of all the good, juicy gossip in the book, when Patti LuPone was about to go to London to premiere Sunset Boulevard, Andrew decided that they actually would open the show in America first in Los Angeles, starring one Glenn Close. But nobody thought, well, maybe we should tell Patty about that. So Andrew's second in command called her up on the phone, and the limousine was in her driveway waiting to take her to the airport, to fly her to London, to open Sunset Boulevard in London. And Andrew's second in command said, Patty, just want you to know, you're going to do London and we've got a deal for New York, but we want you to know we've decided we're going to open Sunset Boulevard in America, in LA, and Glenn Close is going to be the star. And Patty said, Glenn Close? She brays like a donkey, and her nickname is George Washington, because if you look at her in profile, her nose meets her chin. And Patty went to the chauffeur, taking her to the airport to London, and threw her airline tickets at him and says, return these to Andrew Lloyd Webber. And
Wow.
that was the beginning of the end of Sunset Boulevard.
Wow.
How long was Sunset Boulevard? Was it like
That's a diva.
Absolutely. They were all divas back in those days.
Yeah. Yeah.
How long was it before it imploded, Sunset Boulevard?
It ran about 2.5 years on Broadway, and then it just totally collapsed. And then you had Rent. But you know, I do think the sadness of Rent, really, and I went back and I interviewed Jonathan Larson's dad and his sister, Julie, at their house in Los Angeles. And I said, yeah, I really want to understand what Jonathan Larson was all about. I mean, he did create a show, Christine, that you know really changed the way people saw Broadway and inspired a whole generation of kids to come and want to write on Broadway. I mean, Bobby Lopez, who wrote Avenue Q and The Book of Mormon and Frozen, was there because he loved Rent so much. Lin-Manuel Miranda, he saw Rent 30 times, right? Mm-hmm. So I went and I said, you know, what was Jonathan like at that time? And we forget about this. He was at the end of his rope. He had been struggling in New York. He had no money. He'd written shows. None of them went anywhere. And he said to his friends, he said, if this one, Rent, that I'm working at, if it doesn't work, I got to figure out something else to do. I can't do this anymore. I got to make a living somehow. Mm-hmm. So this is it for me. Wow. And he had this wonderful dress rehearsal, New York Theater Workshop, a little tiny theater off Broadway. And he was so happy. He wasn't feeling very well that night, but he was so happy. And he just thought, you know, I got the best cast you could ever have. And I'm just pleased the way this thing is. And he did an interview with a reporter from the New York Times that night and was just excited and alive about everything. And then he went home by himself to his little walk-up apartment, and he put on the tea kettle, and he had an aneurysm, and he dropped dead before he hit his kitchen floor. And he never lived to see what Rent created.
Wow.
Amazing story. Yeah, and I'm glad that you're telling it. Because the book, Singular Sensation, it sounds incredible. We need it right now. We're missing Broadway like crazy. I know you've just got this new book out, but I have an idea for your next one.
Which is?
Keep in touch with all the Broadway people and let us know how they're doing and what everybody's doing to get through this period, and then bringing Broadway back. It's going to be another triumph.
You know, just very quickly at the end, the sadness of all this is Broadway employs 90,000 people, and most of them are not Nathan Lane and Hugh Jackman. Most of them are working people, and they have been out of work for 8 months. And these are people who lived middle-class lives, and they have no income. They have absolutely no income. And I know a lot of kids who were in the chorus of Broadway shows, Christine, and they've had to leave New York and go back to move in with their parents because they can't fall back on what an out-of-work actor used to do, which was wait tables in a restaurant. Well, you know, the restaurants are strapped too. There's no place for them to go. So a lot of the great talent in this city has had to leave because they just can't afford to live here right now.
So obviously a Broadway fan should buy this book, and who else should buy this book?
Anyone, I think, who is interested in how a great art form survives, how it keeps going. And I fundamentally believe, Cubby, once we put this pandemic behind us and we feel safe to congregate again, the best place to get together is at a great Broadway show. And I will be there with you, Christine, on Hugh Jackman's opening night at the revival of The Music Man. I don't know. And Cubby, well, yeah, you'll be with us too. But Christine and I will be in the good seats. You may be up in the balcony, Cubby. But you know.
Yeah, I don't mind that. But I want you two to get back together with a good podcast again. You know, like that. that to me is when Broadway's back, when you guys are
Yeah.
back doing your podcast.
And we can see each other again. I miss you, Christine.
I know. I miss you too, Michael. We can come up with reasons to do a podcast.
I mean,
We can talk to the Broadway folks and what they're up to.
yeah, there's no reason why we can't continue the podcast. I mean, all the Zoom chatting stuff works, so we should get on our bosses and make it happen.
A Zoom/podcast.
There.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations,
Michael Riedel,
Right.
Singular Sensation, The Triumph of Broadway, your second book. Congratulations. I know how hard you worked on it. I know it's phenomenal, so thank you.
Thanks, guys. Great to see you again on Zoom.
You too.
Not as
See
good as in person, but Zoom is the best we can do at this point.
We'll take it.
106.7 Lights FM.